Laughter and scorn filled the air when a dusty black blacksmith arrived on the Sierra Trail to repair a wealthy widow's broken carriage. The well-dressed travelers sneered at his worn tools and calloused hands, whispering that she'd called for the wrong man. But what happened by dawn shocked everyone on that trail, because the struggling blacksmith they mocked wasn't just any craftsman. He was the genius inventor whose revolutionary carriage design had made fortunes for the very man now trying to destroy him. And when Catherine Harrington discovered the truth in those early morning hours, she didn't just change one man's life. She dismantled an empire built on lies, exposed a theft that had robbed an entire community, and proved that justice, no matter how delayed, can still arrive with the force of a lightning strike. This is the story of how prejudice, greed, and stolen dreams collided on a dusty Nevada trail, and how one widow's decision before sunrise would rewrite the future of an entire territory. The autumn sun beat down mercilessly on the Sierra Trail as a weathered wagon rattled to a stop near the broken-down Harrington carriage. Elijah Thornton, 35 years old, with hands scarred from decades of forge work, climbed down from his seat and surveyed the scene with quiet professionalism. His simple cotton shirt was stained with soot, his leather apron worn thin from use, and his tools, carried in a battered wooden box, had seen better days. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. Catherine Harrington's custom carriage, even disabled on the side of the trail, gleamed with polished mahogany and brass fittings worth more than most men earned in a year. Around it stood a small crowd of travelers who'd stopped to offer assistance, all of them well-dressed, all of them white, and all of them now staring at Elijah with expressions ranging from confusion to outright contempt. "This is who they sent?" muttered Samuel Cross, Catherine Harrington's head of operations, loud enough for everyone to hear. He stood near the carriage in his expensive suit, gold watch chain glinting in the sunlight. "I specifically wired for the best wheelwright in Redemption Valley, not some roadside tradesman who looks like he can barely shoe a mule." Elijah heard every word. He'd heard words like that his entire life. He kept his face impassive, his dignity intact, and continued unloading his tools. 35 years of living in Nevada territory had taught him that responding to such provocations only made things worse for men who looked like him. "Mrs. Harrington needs to reach Carson City by nightfall," Cross continued, addressing Elijah now with barely concealed disdain. "Important business with the territorial legislature. Our regular mechanics couldn't identify the problem. If you can't fix it within the hour, we'll send for the team from Virginia City." The other travelers whispered among themselves. One well-dressed merchant leaned toward his wife. "Shameful that a woman of Catherine Harrington's stature has to rely on this. Standards have certainly fallen in the territory." Elijah approached the carriage, his experienced eyes already scanning the undercarriage, the wheel assembly, the suspension system. The Harrington Landau was a masterpiece of engineering. Custom-built, worth at least $3,000, with innovations that most carriage makers in the West couldn't replicate. As he knelt to examine the front axle, he became acutely aware of the eyes on him, judging eyes, dismissive eyes, and then one pair of eyes that felt different. "Let him work," a woman's voice cut through the murmurs like a cavalry saber through silk. Catherine Harrington, 41 years old, stepped down from the covered seating area where she'd been waiting in the shade. Her emerald traveling dress was impeccable despite the dust of the trail, her dark hair pinned elegantly beneath a wide-brimmed hat. But it was her eyes, sharp, intelligent, observant, that commanded attention. She looked past Samuel Cross, past the gawking travelers, directly at Elijah. "How much time do you need?" she asked, her tone neither warm nor cold, simply direct. "Depends on what's broken, ma'am," Elijah replied, meeting her gaze without hesitation. In his experience, powerful white people demanded either excessive deference or punished direct eye contact. He'd learned to read which type he was dealing with in seconds. Catherine Harrington seemed to be evaluating him the same way. "You have 1 hour," she said, checking a delicate silver watch pinned to her bodice. "Impress me, Mr. Thornton, ma'am, Elijah Thornton." Something flickered in her eyes at the name, but it passed so quickly Elijah couldn't be certain he'd seen it. She nodded once and returned to the shade, leaving Samuel Cross standing awkwardly between them, his face reddening with suppressed irritation. As the crowd reluctantly dispersed to their own wagons and horses, Elijah opened his toolbox and began his examination. What he found in the next few minutes made his blood run cold. This wasn't a simple breakdown. The Carriage's revolutionary suspension system, a design he knew intimately for reasons no one on this trail could possibly imagine, had suffered a catastrophic failure that the previous mechanics had completely misdiagnosed. If Catherine Harrington's carriage continued to Carson City in this condition, it would collapse at high speed, likely killing everyone inside. His hands moved with practiced precision as he set to work. None of the watching travelers realized he wasn't just making repairs, he was saving lives. And Catherine Harrington, watching from beneath her parasol with those calculating eyes, wasn't looking at him the way the others were. She was studying him, recognizing something, remembering something. What happened in the next hour would change both their lives forever. Elijah's fingers traced the underside of the carriage's front axle assembly, and his worst suspicions were confirmed. The spring suspension system, an intricate network of leaf springs, shackles, and dampening mechanisms, had fractured in a way that would be invisible to anyone who didn't understand the design's internal architecture. The previous mechanics had clearly examined only the external components, missing the hairline crack in the main load-bearing spring that was seconds away from complete structural failure. "Well?" Samuel Cross's voice came from above, impatient and sharp. "What's the verdict, Blacksmith? Can you fix it, or should I send someone to fetch real craftsmen from Virginia City?" Elijah didn't answer immediately. He was calculating. The repair required complete disassembly of the suspension system, replacement of the fractured spring with a temporary reinforcement, and recalibration of the weight distribution, all within an hour, using only the tools in his battered box. Most master wheelwrights would declare it impossible and recommend a complete carriage replacement. "The main suspension spring has a critical fracture," Elijah finally said, sliding out from beneath the carriage and wiping his hands on a cloth. "Your other mechanics probably checked the wheels, the axle housing, maybe the brake assembly, but they missed the real problem." "And what problem is that?" Cross asked, his tone dripping with skepticism. "If this carriage travels another 5 miles at anything faster than a walking pace, the spring will snap completely, the front axle will collapse, the carriage will flip, and everyone inside will be thrown at full speed." Elijah's voice was calm, factual. "At best, broken bones. At worst, broken necks." The color drained from Cross's face. Several of the nearby travelers who'd been eavesdropping gasped audibly. Catherine Harrington rose from her seat and walked toward them, her expression unreadable. "That's absurd," Cross sputtered, though his voice had lost its certainty. "This carriage is brand new, custom-built by Caldwell Manufacturing. Vincent Caldwell himself assured me it was the finest suspension system in the Western Territories. There's no way." "The design is excellent," Elijah interrupted quietly. "The craftsmanship of this particular build is not. Someone cut corners on the tempering process. The spring steel wasn't heat-treated properly. It's a miracle you made it this far without catastrophic failure." Catherine stopped 3 feet from Elijah, studying him with an intensity that made even Samuel Cross fall silent. "Can you fix it?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "In an hour?" "Yes, ma'am." "Mr. Thornton," she said slowly, and there was that flicker in her eyes again. "How do you know so much about the Caldwell suspension system?" "It's a proprietary design. The specifications aren't publicly available." For just a moment, Elijah's carefully maintained composure cracked. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I know good metalwork from bad, Mrs. Harrington, and I know when a spring is about to fail. That's all you need to be concerned with right now." The silence that followed was heavy with unasked questions. Then Catherine nodded once. "Then I suggest you begin, Mr. Thornton. And I suggest everyone else give him space to work." She directed that last comment at Samuel Cross, who opened his mouth to protest, then thought better of it under her withering gaze. As the crowd reluctantly backed away, Elijah returned to his work with renewed focus. He pulled out tools that made several onlookers whisper in surprise, precision instruments that seemed far too sophisticated for a struggling blacksmith. A custom torque wrench, a spring compression gauge, a set of tempering hammers that bore the unmistakable marks of master craftsmanship. These weren't the tools of a roadside tradesman. They were the tools of an engineer. As Elijah worked, removing bolts with surgical precision, his mind drifted to memories he'd tried to bury for 3 years. The workshop in Silver Creek, where he'd spent nights perfecting the suspension design. The excitement of finally solving the problem that had plagued carriage makers for decades. How to absorb shock while maintaining stability at high speeds. Vincent Caldwell's interested expression when Elijah presented the completed prototype, the handshake, the promise of partnership, and then, 3 days later, being escorted out of Caldwell Manufacturing by armed guards, accused of theft, his name dragged through every newspaper in the territory as an uppity Negro who'd tried to steal proprietary designs. 30 minutes into the repair, Catherine Harrington approached again, this time alone. She watched him work in silence for several minutes, her sharp eyes missing nothing, not the expert way he handled the tools, not the modifications he was making, not the small innovations he was incorporating into the temporary repair. "Mr. Thornton," she finally said, her voice low enough that only he could hear, "when we reach Carson City, I'd like you to accompany me to my office. There's something I need to discuss with you. Something important." Elijah paused. A bolt halfway tightened in his grip. He looked up at her, searching for the trap he'd learned to expect from wealthy white employers. But Catherine Harrington's face showed only careful consideration and something that looked almost like recognition. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly, and returned to work. What neither of them knew was that Samuel Cross had heard every word, and his hand was already moving toward the telegram office in Carson City in his mind, composing a message to Vincent Caldwell that would set in motion a confrontation 3 years in the making. 53 minutes after he began, Elijah Thornton slid out from beneath the Harrington carriage and stood, wiping the dust and grease from his hands. The suspension system, which had been on the verge of catastrophic failure, was now not only repaired but reinforced in ways that would actually improve its performance beyond the original specifications. "It's done," he announced simply. Samuel Cross emerged from the shade where he'd been pacing anxiously for the past hour. "Done? That quickly? I find that hard to believe. How can we be certain?" "Test it," Elijah said, gesturing toward the carriage. "Have your driver take it around the bend and back. Slowly at first, then at normal speed. You'll feel the difference immediately." Catherine Harrington had been watching the entire time from her vantage point, her parasol casting shadows across her thoughtful expression. Now she nodded to her driver, a grizzled man named Robert who'd been with her company for 15 years. "Do as he says, Robert, carefully." The driver climbed aboard, released the brake, and urged the horses forward. The carriage rolled smoothly along the trail, its movement noticeably different from before. The bouncing and rattling that had characterized the journey from Redemption Valley was gone, replaced by a fluid glide that drew murmurs of amazement from the watching travelers. When Robert returned, his weathered face showed genuine surprise. "Mrs. Harrington, I've driven 100 carriages in my time, including this one since it was built. I've never felt it ride this smooth. Whatever he did, it's not just fixed, it's better than when we left the factory." Cross's expression darkened with suspicion. "Better? That's impossible. The Caldwell design is already the finest in the West. Unless..." His eyes narrowed as he looked at Elijah. unless you've tampered with proprietary mechanisms, modified the design without authorization. That's industrial sabotage. I improved a flawed design, Elijah replied evenly. The original suspension concept is sound, but the execution had 3 critical weaknesses. The spring tension was miscalibrated for the weight distribution. The dampening ratio was too rigid for uneven terrain, and the connection points between the leaf springs and the axle housing created unnecessary stress fractures. I corrected all 3. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the horses seemed to sense the tension in the air. Catherine Harrington stepped forward, her eyes locked on Elijah with an intensity that made him deeply uncomfortable. "Mr. Thornton," she said slowly, "you just described the exact 3 problems that Vincent Caldwell's chief engineer identified in the original design specifications. Problems that supposedly took him 6 months and a team of 5 craftsmen to solve. You diagnosed and fixed them in under an hour alone, with basic tools." "Not basic tools, ma'am," Elijah corrected quietly, then immediately regretted drawing attention to his equipment. But Catherine's sharp mind had already made the connection. She walked to his toolbox, still open on the ground, and examined its contents. Her fingers traced the custom torque wrench, then stopped on something else, a small metal plate riveted to the inside of the lid, partially obscured by years of wear and soot. She knelt down, pulled out a handkerchief, and wiped the plate clean. The watching crowd couldn't see what was engraved there, but Catherine Harrington could. Her sharp intake of breath was barely audible, but Elijah heard it. His entire body tensed. "E.T.," she read aloud. "Master Craftsman, Silver Creek, Nevada Territory, 1872. She looked up at him, and this time there was no mistaking the recognition in her eyes. Elijah Thornton, I.T., the same initials stamped on the original patent applications for the Caldwell suspension system, applications that were filed in 1872 and later transferred to Vincent Caldwell's name in 1873. Several of the travelers gasped. Samuel Cross went pale, his hand instinctively moving to the telegram he'd already composed in his mind. "That's absurd," Cross said, his voice rising with panic barely disguised as indignation. "Mrs. Harrington, surely you're not suggesting that this Blacksmith is somehow connected to advanced carriage engineering? Vincent Caldwell developed that system himself. I was there. I saw him present it to the board." "I'm sure you did," Catherine replied, not taking her eyes off Elijah. "Just as I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for why a struggling blacksmith carries master craftsman tools, can diagnose complex engineering failures instantly, and knows the intimate details of a supposedly proprietary design." Elijah remained silent. 3 years of forced obscurity, 3 years of keeping his head down and his mouth shut, 3 years of survival, all of it had taught him that speaking the truth to powerful people only brought more pain. But Catherine Harrington wasn't looking at him with contempt or suspicion. She was looking at him the way one engineer looks at another when they recognize undeniable genius. "Mr. Thornton," she said, rising to her feet and brushing the dust from her dress, "I'm no longer requesting your presence in Carson City. I'm insisting on it. You will ride with me, and we will have a very long conversation about the Caldwell suspension system, your toolbox, and why a man of your obvious abilities is working as a struggling blacksmith instead of running an engineering firm." She turned to Samuel Cross, whose face had gone from pale to crimson. "Send word ahead that our meetings today are postponed. I have more important business to attend to. But Mrs. Harrington, the territorial contracts—" "Can wait," she cut him off. "This cannot." As Catherine's driver prepared the carriage for departure, she extended her hand to Elijah, not for him to kiss or bow over, as was common, but for a handshake, an equal's handshake. "Shall we, Mr. Thornton?" Elijah looked at her offered hand, then at the faces around him, some confused, some outraged, and Samuel Cross's twisted with barely concealed fury. He thought of his father's warnings about getting involved with powerful white folks' business. He thought of the last time he'd trusted someone with his innovations. But he also thought of 3 years in obscurity, 3 years of watching another man profit from his genius, 3 years of being invisible. He took her hand. "Yes, ma'am." The ride to Carson City took 2 hours, and for the first hour, neither Catherine Harrington nor Elijah Thornton spoke. They sat across from each other in the carriage's plush interior. The smooth ride, courtesy of Elijah's repairs, a constant reminder of the unspoken tension between them. Samuel Cross had been left behind to arrange alternative transportation, his protests falling on deaf ears. Finally, as the outskirts of Carson City appeared on the horizon, Catherine broke the silence. "Tell me your full name and background, Mr. Thornton. Everything." Elijah studied her face, searching for the trap. "Why does it matter, ma'am?" "Because," she said, pulling a leather portfolio from beneath her seat, "3 months ago, I purchased Caldwell Manufacturing Company. The sale included all patents, designs, and intellectual property records. And during my review of those records, I found something very interesting." She opened the portfolio and extracted a set of documents, laying them carefully on the seat between them. Even upside down, Elijah recognized the diagrams. His diagrams, drawn in his own hand 5 years ago, in the cramped workshop behind his father's forge in Silver Creek. "The original patent applications for the suspension system," Catherine continued, "were filed in April 1872 by someone with the initials E.T. 3 weeks later. Those same applications were amended with a transfer of ownership to Vincent Caldwell, citing E.T. as a contract laborer who had signed away all rights to his work." Elijah's hands clenched involuntarily. "You bought Caldwell Manufacturing?" "I did." Vincent Caldwell was drowning in debt and facing multiple lawsuits over defective carriages built using shortcuts and inferior materials that the original design never called for. He was desperate for capital. She paused. "I've spent the past 3 months investigating why such a brilliant design kept failing in production. Now, I think I understand. The man who designed it wasn't there to oversee its construction." "Ma'am, I don't know what you think you've discovered, but—" "Elijah Thornton," Catherine interrupted, reading from another document. "Born 1843, Silver Creek, Nevada Territory. Son of Thomas Thornton, master blacksmith. Apprenticed under your father from age 8. At 16, began designing custom tools and mechanical improvements. At 22, developed a revolutionary suspension system that could absorb shock while maintaining stability at high speeds. At 23, approached Vincent Caldwell with a partnership proposal." She looked up, her eyes sharp. "At 23, you were escorted out of Caldwell Manufacturing by armed guards, accused of attempting to steal proprietary designs, and blacklisted throughout the territory. Every newspaper from here to San Francisco printed Caldwell's version of events, that a presumptuous colored blacksmith had tried to claim credit for his employer's genius." The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Elijah's jaw tightened, old wounds reopening. "How do you know all this?" he asked quietly. "Because I'm a widow who inherited a manufacturing empire from a husband who built it by crushing competitors and stealing innovations," Catherine replied, her voice suddenly weary. "And when I took over, I found files. Secret files documenting every patent he'd acquired, every inventor he'd ruined, every innovation he'd stolen. Your name was in those files, Mr. Thornton, along with 6 others. All of them skilled craftsmen, all of them colored or Mexican, all of them discredited and destroyed." Elijah felt the carriage walls closing in on him. "Why are you telling me this?" Catherine leaned forward. "Because my late husband taught me how the game is played in the West. Powerful men take what they want from those without power, and the law protects them. Vincent Caldwell learned that game well. He approached you with promises of partnership, had you sign what you thought were collaboration agreements, then used those very documents to claim you were merely a contract laborer with no rights to your own creations." "I was young," Elijah said bitterly, "naive. I believed that genius and hard work mattered more than the color of a man's skin. They should, Catherine said. They don't. But that doesn't mean we can't change the rules. She pulled out another document, this one newer, the ink barely dry. This is a deed transfer. When I purchased Caldwell Manufacturing, I also purchased all his records, including the original contracts you signed. I've had my lawyers review them extensively. Elijah's heart began to pound. The contracts Caldwell used were fraudulent, Catherine continued. He deliberately misrepresented them as partnership agreements, while the legal language assigned all intellectual property to him. In any honest court, they'd be thrown out as exploitative and deceptive. But we both know how honest territorial courts are when it comes to cases involving colored plaintiffs. So nothing can be done, Elijah said flatly. I didn't say that. Catherine's eyes gleamed. Caldwell sold me his company to pay off debts, but he didn't just sell me the legitimate assets. He sold me the evidence of his crimes, every stolen patent, every forged document, every piece of correspondence showing his deliberate theft of intellectual property, including a particularly damning letter where he explicitly discusses how to eliminate the Negro's claim to the suspension system. Elijah's breath caught. You have written proof? I have everything. Letters, contracts, even testimony from former employees willing to confirm that you were the true inventor. Caldwell was meticulous about documentation. He just never imagined someone would buy his company and use his own records against him. The carriage rolled to a stop in front of an impressive 3-story building bearing a sign, Harrington Manufacturing Company, Carson City Headquarters. Catherine gathered her documents. Mr. Thornton, I didn't bring you here just to tell you that you were wronged. I brought you here to offer you a choice. You can walk away right now, return to your forge, and continue your life as it is. Or you can come inside, review the evidence with my lawyers, and help me do something that's never been done in Nevada territory. And what's that? Elijah asked. Catherine smiled, a sharp, determined smile that reminded Elijah of a cavalry officer before a charge. We're going to sue Vincent Caldwell for intellectual property theft. We're going to expose every patent he stole, every inventor he ruined, and we're going to prove that a black blacksmith from Silver Creek is the true genius behind the most revolutionary carriage design in the American West. She extended her hand again. The question is, are you brave enough to fight back? Elijah looked at her hand, then at the building beyond, then back at the documents that contained the evidence of his stolen dreams. For 3 years, he'd survived by being invisible, by keeping his head down, by accepting his place in a world that had no room for men like him to be brilliant. But Catherine Harrington was offering him something more dangerous than survival. She was offering him justice. He took her hand. Yes, ma'am, I am. Catherine Harrington's office occupied the entire 3rd floor of the building, a sprawling space filled with drafting tables, filing cabinets, and mechanical models of various carriage designs. Elijah had barely stepped through the door when a sharp-featured woman in her 50s rose from a desk covered in legal documents. Mr. Thornton, I presume, the woman said, extending her hand. I'm Judge Martha Brennan, retired from the territorial bench and now serving as Mrs. Harrington's chief legal counsel. I've been waiting 3 months to meet you. 3 months, Elijah repeated, shaking her hand cautiously. That's how long we've been building this case, Judge Brennan replied, gesturing to stacks of documents that covered an entire table. When Catherine discovered the fraudulent contracts in Caldwell's files, she brought them to me immediately. What we found went far beyond simple theft. Catherine removed her hat and gloves, her demeanor shifting from refined society woman to focused businesswoman. Show him, Martha. Judge Brennan opened a large ledger. Vincent Caldwell didn't just steal your suspension design, Mr. Thornton. Over the past 7 years, he systematically targeted skilled craftsmen from marginalized communities, free black men, Mexican artisans, Chinese metal workers, anyone who lacked the social standing to fight back legally. He'd offer them partnership, get them to demonstrate their innovations, have them sign collaboration agreements that were actually property transfers, then discard them and claim the work as his own. She turned the ledger toward Elijah. Inside were names, dates, and descriptions of stolen inventions, a brake system, a weatherproofing technique, an improved wheel hub design. 7 names total, including his own. We've located 5 of the 7 men, Catherine added. 2 have since passed away, but the 5 who remain are willing to testify if we can guarantee their safety and legal protection. Testify where? Elijah asked, though he already suspected the answer. In court, Judge Brennan said firmly. We're filing a lawsuit against Vincent Caldwell for fraud, intellectual property theft, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of their lawful rights. It will be the largest case of its kind in Nevada Territory history. Before Elijah could respond, the office door burst open without warning. Vincent Caldwell stood in the doorway, flanked by Samuel Cross and 2 men who looked like hired muscle. Caldwell was 52, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, with the kind of commanding presence that came from decades of getting exactly what he wanted. "Catherine," he said, his voice dripping with false cordiality, "I received a very disturbing telegram from Samuel about your passenger. I came immediately to clear up what must surely be a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding, Vincent," Catherine replied coldly. "Please leave my office. Not until we discuss this slander that you're apparently planning to spread about my business practices." His eyes fell on Elijah, and his expression hardened into pure contempt. "So, Elijah Thornton, still telling your pathetic lies about being an inventor, I see. Some people never learn their place." "Mr. Caldwell," Judge Brennan interjected, "you are trespassing on private property. I suggest you depart before I have the marshal." "The marshal answers to the territorial board, and I sit on that board," Caldwell interrupted, "along with the mining commissioner, the land office director, and half the judges in Carson City. You're a retired judge, Martha. You have no power here." He turned his attention back to Catherine. "I don't know what this boy has told you, but whatever fantasy he's spinning about creating the suspension system is exactly that, a fantasy. I have legal documents proving that any work he did was as my employee, surrendering all rights to his labor. Documents signed by him, documents you fraudulently misrepresented," Catherine shot back. Caldwell laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "Misrepresented? He signed them willingly. If he was too ignorant to read the contracts, that's his failure, not mine. The law is clear. Employees don't own their innovations. Their employers do." "Even when those employees are lied to about the nature of the contracts they're signing?" Judge Brennan asked. "Prove it," Caldwell sneered. "Prove that I lied. In a court of law, with witnesses. Do you really think any jury in this territory will take the word of a colored blacksmith over mine? Over my reputation, my standing in the community?" The room fell silent. It was the question that had haunted Elijah for 3 years, the insurmountable wall that had kept him from even attempting to fight back. Caldwell was right. The law, the courts, the entire system was designed to protect men like him and crush men like Elijah. But Catherine Harrington smiled, that same sharp, dangerous smile from the carriage. She walked to her desk and picked up a folder bound in red leather. "Actually, Vincent, I don't need a jury to take Elijah's word over yours," she said sweetly. "I have your own words, in writing." Caldwell's confidence faltered for just a moment. "What are you talking about?" Catherine opened the folder and began reading. Letter dated May 15th, 1872, from Vincent Caldwell to Harrison Whitmore, attorney at law. Quote, "The Negro blacksmith suspension design is extraordinary, far beyond anything my team could develop. We must secure it immediately, but obviously cannot enter into actual partnership with someone of his race. Draft the standard contract using partnership language, but ensure ownership transfers completely to me. He's uneducated enough that he won't understand the legal terminology. Once we have the patent, we'll dismiss him and claim the work as mine. Who would believe a colored tradesman could create such sophisticated engineering? The color drained from Caldwell's face. Catherine continued, pulling out more documents. I have 12 more letters just like this one, Vincent, discussing strategies to steal innovations, forge documents, and destroy the reputations of the men you exploited. You were so confident in your power, you documented everything. Those are private correspondence, Caldwell stammered. Legally privileged. They became my property when you sold me Caldwell Manufacturing to cover your debts, Catherine interrupted. Every file, every letter, every piece of paper in your office. You sold me the evidence of your own crimes. Samuel Cross stepped forward desperately. Mrs. Harrington, you can't possibly intend to make this public. The scandal would destroy not just Mr. Caldwell, but damage the entire manufacturing sector's reputation. Think of the business consequences. I'm thinking very clearly about the consequences, Samuel, Catherine replied. Which is why you're also dismissed from my employment, effective immediately. I found your correspondence too, the letters where you helped Caldwell identify and target vulnerable craftsmen. You were complicit in every theft. Cross's face went crimson. You can't prove. Get out, Catherine said, her voice like iron. Both of you. You have until tomorrow morning to secure legal representation. Judge Brennan will be filing the lawsuit at noon. Caldwell's mask of civility finally cracked completely. He pointed a shaking finger at Elijah. You think you've won something here, boy? You think she actually cares about you? She's using you for her own purposes. When this is over, you'll still be nothing. Just another colored tradesman that nobody remembers. Perhaps, Elijah replied quietly, speaking for the first time since Caldwell's arrival. But I'll be a colored tradesman who destroyed your empire, and people will remember that. Caldwell's eyes burned with rage, but he said nothing more. He turned and strode from the office, Samuel Cross scurrying behind him, the hired muscle following with uncertain expressions. When the door slammed shut, Elijah released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. That's, Judge Brennan said with satisfaction, went even better than I hoped. His reaction confirms everything. A confident, innocent man would have laughed off the accusations. A guilty man responds with threats and intimidation. Catherine walked to the window, watching Caldwell's carriage pull away below. He'll fight back. He has resources, connections, allies in the territorial government. So do we, Judge Brennan replied, looking at Elijah. We have the truth. And we have the one thing Caldwell fears most, proof that he's not the genius he's pretended to be for 7 years. Just a thief who got caught. Elijah stood in the center of the office, surrounded by evidence of crimes committed against him and others like him, and felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, hope. After Caldwell's departure, Catherine poured 3 glasses of brandy from a crystal decanter, handing one to Judge Brennan and offering the second to Elijah. He hesitated before accepting. Sharing drinks with wealthy white women wasn't exactly common practice for black tradesmen in Nevada territory. To truth, Catherine said, raising her glass. They drank in silence, and then Catherine gestured for Elijah to sit at the large conference table. Judge Brennan spread out more documents, these ones newer, with ink barely dry. Mr. Thornton, Catherine began, before we proceed with the lawsuit, I need to be completely honest with you about what we're facing. Vincent Caldwell wasn't exaggerating about his connections. He sits on the territorial board, he has investments in half the major businesses in Carson City, and he's personal friends with 2 judges and the territorial governor. So we can't win, Elijah said flatly. I didn't say that. Catherine leaned forward. But winning won't be simple, and it won't be quick. Caldwell will use every legal maneuver available to delay, discredit, and destroy this case. He'll attack your character, your credentials, and your credibility. He'll paint you as a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge. And he'll use every ounce of his influence to turn public opinion against us. Why are you telling me this? Elijah asked. Having second thoughts? No, I'm making sure you understand what you're agreeing to." Catherine's eyes were serious. "This fight will take months, possibly years. It will be expensive, exhausting, and brutal. And even if we win in court, there's no guarantee the judgment will change anything in the broader world. You could emerge victorious in law, but still struggle to find work, still face the same prejudice, still be seen as nothing more than a troublemaking blacksmith who got lucky." Judge Brennan nodded. "She's right, Mr. Thornton. Justice in the courtroom doesn't automatically translate to justice in society. You need to go into this with clear eyes." Elijah set down his glass. "Then why fight at all?" "Because," Catherine said, pulling out another folder, "this case isn't just about you. It's about something much larger." She opened the folder to reveal a detailed investigation report. "For the past 8 months, I've been documenting systematic patterns of innovation theft throughout Nevada territory. Vincent Caldwell is just one player in a much bigger game. There are mining engineers who've stolen ore processing techniques from Chinese workers, ranch owners who've claimed irrigation designs created by Mexican laborers, factory managers who've patented machinery improvements developed by immigrant craftsmen." Elijah's eyes widened as he scanned the pages. Dozens of names, hundreds of stolen innovations. "The pattern is always the same," Judge Brennan added. "Identify talented people from marginalized communities, exploit their lack of legal resources and social standing, steal their work, destroy their credibility if they complain. It's not just happening, it's a deliberate strategy used by powerful men throughout the West. And you want to expose all of it," Elijah said slowly, understanding dawning. "I want to dismantle it," Catherine corrected, "starting with Caldwell but not ending there. If we can prove intellectual property theft in your case, if we can show that a black craftsman's genius was deliberately stolen and that the theft was documented and systematic, we create legal precedent. We give other victims a path to fight back." She slid a new document across the table. "This is my proposal, Mr. Thornton. I'm not just offering to fund your lawsuit. I'm proposing a partnership, a real one, with legal protections and equal standing." Elijah picked up the document, reading carefully this time. His breath caught. "You want to create a legal defense fund," he said, "specifically for craftsmen and inventors from marginalized communities who've had their work stolen." "Not just a defense fund," Catherine clarified. "A complete support system. Legal representation, documentation services, patent filing assistance, and public advocacy. Headquartered right here in Carson City, funded by my manufacturing profits, and directed by someone who understands both the technical and personal aspects of innovation theft." She paused meaningfully. "Directed by you, if you'll accept the position." Elijah stared at her. "You want me to run this organization?" "I want you to build it," Catherine said. "I have the resources and the legal standing. You have the credibility and the expertise. Together we can create something that outlasts both of us, a system that protects innovators instead of exploiting them." Judge Brennan added, "There's also the matter of your stolen patents, Mr. Thornton. When we win this case, and I believe we will, you'll be entitled to significant financial compensation. Royalties from every carriage built using your suspension design over the past 3 years. We estimate somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000. The number was staggering, more money than Elijah had earned in his entire life. "But," Catherine continued, "there's something else. Something I discovered only recently." She pulled out one final document, a worn notebook with sketches and calculations. "This was in your father's forge when I sent investigators to gather evidence about your background. Your father gave it to them willingly." Elijah recognized it immediately. His personal design journal from 5 years ago, filled with innovations he'd developed but never had the resources to pursue. Advanced brake systems, lightweight carriage frames, shock-absorbing wheel designs. "There are at least 12 patentable innovations in this notebook," Catherine said quietly. "Innovations that you created but never filed because you didn't have the money or the connections. With proper funding and legal support, every single one of these could be developed, patented in your name, and manufactured. She met his eyes directly. I'm not offering you charity, Mr. Thornton. I'm offering you what you should have had 3 years ago, a genuine partnership with someone who has the resources to turn your genius into reality. You provide the innovations. I provide the manufacturing infrastructure and market access. We split the profits equally, and we use those profits to fund the legal defense organization. Elijah's hands trembled slightly as he held the notebook. Inside were dreams he'd abandoned, ideas he'd convinced himself would never see the light of day. Why, he asked, his voice rough, why are you really doing this? You could have buried Caldwell's crimes, kept the stolen patents, and no one would have questioned it. Why expose everything? Why risk your reputation and your business relationships for people like me? Catherine was silent for a long moment. Then she walked to the window, looking out over Carson City. My husband built his empire by crushing people, she said quietly. When he died and left it all to me, I had a choice. I could continue his legacy, or I could try to build something different, something better. She turned back to face him. I chose better. Not because I'm a saint, Mr. Thornton, because I'm a businesswoman who understands that sustainable success comes from cultivating talent, not stealing it. And because I'm tired of watching genius go to waste simply because it comes wrapped in the wrong color skin. Judge Brennan stood. The clock is ticking, Mr. Thornton. We file the lawsuit tomorrow at noon. If you're in, we need to prepare your testimony tonight. If you're out, we'll proceed with the case using the documentary evidence alone. But it will be significantly weaker without you. Elijah looked at the documents spread before him. The evidence of crimes committed against him. The proposal for partnership. The notebook full of abandoned dreams. And the faces of the 5 other men whose innovations had been stolen. Men who were waiting to see if justice was actually possible. He thought of his father, still working the forge in Silver Creek at 70 years old, his hands gnarled from decades of labor. He thought of every talented young black craftsman in the territory who would face the same choice he'd faced: surrender your dreams or fight a system designed to crush you. I'm in, he said, not just for me, for all of them. Catherine extended her hand across the table, not as employer to employee, but as partner to partner. Then let's make history, Mr. Thornton. Their handshake sealed more than a business agreement. It sealed a declaration of war against an entire system of exploitation. A war that would be fought not with guns, but with legal documents, undeniable evidence, and the revolutionary idea that genius deserved recognition regardless of the color of the hands that created it. Outside the window, the sun was setting over Carson City, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. By dawn, nothing would ever be the same. The Merchants' Hall in Carson City had never seen a crowd like this. Every seat in the gallery was filled, with dozens more people standing along the walls and spilling out into the corridors. Word of the lawsuit had spread like wildfire through the territory. A black blacksmith suing one of Nevada's most powerful businessmen for intellectual property theft. Some came seeking justice. Others came hoping to watch Elijah Thornton be humiliated. All of them came because they knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. Judge Samuel Morrison presided from the bench, a silver-haired man known for fairness but also for strict adherence to legal precedent that had never favored men like Elijah. Vincent Caldwell sat at the defendant's table with 3 expensive lawyers from San Francisco, his expression carefully arranged into one of wounded dignity. Beside him, Samuel Cross looked significantly less composed, his eyes darting nervously around the packed courtroom. At the plaintiff's table, Elijah sat between Catherine Harrington and Judge Martha Brennan, wearing a new suit that Catherine had insisted on purchasing. He'd protested, but she'd been firm. You're not walking into that courtroom looking like you need their charity. You're walking in looking like the engineer you are. Judge Morrison's gavel fell. This court is now in session. The case of Thornton versus Caldwell regarding claims of intellectual property theft, fraud, and breach of contract. Judge Brennan, you may present your opening statement. Martha Brennan stood, and the courtroom fell silent. Your Honor, this case is fundamentally simple. Mr. Vincent Caldwell deliberately and systematically stole innovations from Mr. Elijah Thornton and at least 6 other craftsmen, profiting enormously while destroying their livelihoods and reputations. We will prove this not through speculation or circumstantial evidence, but through Mr. Caldwell's own written words, correspondence in which he explicitly details his scheme to defraud inventors who lacked the social standing to fight back. Caldwell's lead attorney, a sharp-faced man named Harrison Whitmore, rose immediately. Objection, Your Honor. These allegations are inflammatory and unsupported. Mr. Caldwell is a respected businessman who— Save it for your opening statement, Mr. Whitmore, Judge Morrison interrupted. Judge Brennan, proceed. Over the next hour, Martha Brennan methodically presented the case. She introduced the original patent applications with Elijah's initials. She displayed the fraudulent contracts Caldwell had used, side by side with honest partnership agreements to show the deceptive language. She called 3 of the other victimized inventors to testify: a Mexican wheelwright, a Chinese metalworker, and a free black carpenter, each telling eerily similar stories of promises betrayed and innovations stolen. But the moment that changed everything came when Martha Brennan introduced Exhibit 47, Vincent Caldwell's personal correspondence. Mr. Caldwell, she said, would you please read this letter, dated May 15, 1872, that you wrote to your attorney, Harrison Whitmore? The courtroom erupted in murmurs when people realized that Caldwell's own lawyer was named in the correspondence. Whitmore's face went pale. Caldwell refused. I don't recognize that document. That's interesting, Martha replied, because it bears your signature, matches the handwriting analysis performed by 3 independent experts, and was written on your personal letterhead. But if you won't read it, I will. She read the damning letter aloud, every calculated word about exploiting the Negro blacksmith's genius, every cruel strategy for stealing his work, every contemptuous reference to how no one would believe a colored tradesman could create such sophisticated engineering. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Then Martha pulled out another letter, and another, and another. 12 letters total, spanning 5 years, documenting a deliberate pattern of targeting vulnerable inventors, stealing their innovations, and destroying their credibility. Your Honor, Harrison Whitmore stood desperately. These letters are private correspondence obtained through a legal business acquisition, Martha interrupted. When Mr. Caldwell sold his company to Mrs. Harrington to pay his debts, all company files became her legal property, including his personal correspondence stored in company offices. Judge Morrison leaned forward. Mr. Whitmore, did you assist your client in drafting fraudulent contracts as described in these letters? Whitmore's silence was answer enough. I'll take that as grounds for a separate investigation, Morrison said coldly. Continue, Judge Brennan. The final blow came when Martha called Elijah to the stand. For 90 minutes he explained the suspension system's design in meticulous technical detail, details that Vincent Caldwell, who'd claimed authorship, couldn't possibly know. He described the months of development, the failed prototypes, the breakthrough that had solved the stability problem. Then Martha asked the question that sealed Caldwell's fate. Mr. Thornton, can you explain the specific mathematical calculations used to determine the spring tension ratios in your suspension design? Elijah walked to a chalkboard and spent 20 minutes working through complex engineering mathematics, filling the board with equations and diagrams that left the gallery murmuring in amazement. When he finished, Martha turned to Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell, since you claim to have invented this system, surely you can explain these calculations. Caldwell's face reddened. I don't need to prove my expertise to— That's not an answer, Mr. Caldwell. Can you explain the mathematics behind your own supposed invention? The silence stretched. Caldwell looked at his lawyers, but they had no rescue to offer. "I employ engineers to handle technical details," he finally muttered. "So you can't actually explain how the system you allegedly invented actually works?" Martha pressed. "Objection," Whitmore shouted, badgering the witness. "Overruled," Judge Morrison said. "Answer the question, Mr. Caldwell." "No," Caldwell admitted, his voice barely audible. "I cannot explain the specific calculations." The courtroom exploded in conversation. Judge Morrison's gavel pounded for order. Catherine Harrington watched from the gallery, her expression neutral, but Elijah caught the slight smile at the corner of her mouth. They'd done it. The truth was out, undeniable and devastating. Judge Morrison called for a brief recess, but when court reconvened, his decision came swiftly. Having reviewed the evidence presented, particularly Mr. Caldwell's own written admission of fraudulent intent, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Elijah Thornton. Mr. Caldwell is ordered to pay full restitution of all profits derived from the stolen suspension design, plus damages. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the territorial prosecutor for potential criminal charges of fraud and conspiracy. He looked directly at Caldwell, his expression stern. "Mr. Caldwell, you have brought disgrace not only upon yourself, but upon the entire business community of Nevada Territory. Your actions represent a betrayal of the principles of honest enterprise and basic human decency. The judgment of this court is that Elijah Thornton is the true and lawful inventor of the suspension system, and all patents shall be transferred to his name immediately." The gavel fell with finality. Vincent Caldwell sat frozen, his empire crumbling around him in real time. Samuel Cross had already slipped out of the courtroom, abandoning his former employer to face the consequences alone. As people rushed forward to congratulate Elijah, he remained seated, overwhelmed by the moment. 3 years of invisibility, 3 years of stolen credit, 3 years of being told he was nothing, all of it validated, acknowledged, corrected. Catherine appeared at his side. "How does it feel?" she asked quietly. Elijah looked at the crowd, at the other inventors whose testimonies had helped secure the victory, at Judge Brennan gathering documents, at his father in the front row with tears streaming down his weathered face. "Like dawn," he said simply, "like the sun finally rising after the longest night of my life." But both of them knew this was only the beginning. The real work, transforming one legal victory into lasting systemic change, was still ahead. Outside the Merchants' Hall, the newsboys were already shouting headlines. "Black inventor defeats industrial titan. Caldwell empire exposed as fraud." By morning, the story would be in every newspaper from San Francisco to Denver. The world was changing, one verdict at a time. 18 months after the verdict, the landscape of Nevada Territory had transformed in ways that even Catherine Harrington hadn't fully anticipated. The modest building that had once housed Caldwell Manufacturing now bore a different sign: Thornton Harrington Innovation Works. Below it, in smaller letters, "Where Genius Finds Justice." Elijah Thornton stood on the workshop floor, no longer wearing the soot-stained apron of a struggling blacksmith, but the practical vest and rolled sleeves of a working engineer. Around him, 24 craftsmen and inventors, black, Mexican, Chinese, and white, collaborated on projects that ranged from improved mining equipment to revolutionary agricultural machinery. The workshop hummed with the sound of innovation unshackled from prejudice. "The Springfield Rail Company order is ready for review," announced Maria Vasquez, a Mexican engineer whose irrigation pump design had been stolen by a ranch owner until the Thornton Harrington Legal Fund had won back her patents. She now led the agricultural division, her innovations helping transform farming throughout the West. "Excellent," Elijah replied, examining the technical drawings she had brought. "Your efficiency improvements are remarkable, Maria. This could reduce water waste by 40%. In the corner office that overlooked the workshop, Catherine reviewed financial reports with satisfaction. The partnership had proven even more profitable than she'd projected. Elijah's innovations, properly manufactured and marketed, had generated over $200,000 in revenue in just 18 months. More importantly, the 12 other patents they'd recovered from various thieves had created a portfolio worth nearly $500,000. Vincent Caldwell, meanwhile, had disappeared from public life entirely. Facing criminal charges and buried under lawsuits from the other inventors he'd defrauded, he'd sold his remaining assets and fled to San Francisco. Rumors suggested he was working as a clerk in a shipping office, his reputation destroyed beyond repair. Samuel Cross had met a similar fate, disbarred from business dealings in Nevada Territory and last seen working at a supply depot in Sacramento. "Some people call it revenge," Elijah had told a reporter from the Territorial Gazette. "I call it consequences." Mr. Caldwell spent years believing he was untouchable because of his wealth and connections. He learned that justice, though often delayed, eventually finds its mark. But the true victory wasn't Caldwell's downfall. It was what had risen in its place. The Inventors Defense and Advocacy Center, housed in the building adjacent to the workshop, had become a beacon for marginalized creators throughout the West. Judge Martha Brennan, now Director of Legal Services, had recovered 43 stolen patents in 18 months, representing inventors from 6 territories. Each case followed the blueprint established by Elijah's victory: meticulous documentation, undeniable evidence, and relentless legal pressure. "The system hasn't fundamentally changed," Martha explained during a speech at the territorial capital, "but we've created a counter-system, one that protects those the law was designed to ignore. Every patent we recover, every inventor we vindicate, strengthens the precedent that genius has no color, and theft is theft regardless of who commits it." The impact extended beyond individual cases. 3 territorial judges had been removed from the bench for accepting bribes to rule against minority inventors. 5 major companies had reformed their employment contracts after facing legal action. And the territorial legislature, pressured by the mounting evidence of systematic exploitation, had passed new protections for intellectual property rights. On the 2-year anniversary of the trail encounter that had changed everything, Catherine and Elijah organized a special event. Every inventor that the Defense Center had helped was invited, along with their families and the young people from communities throughout the territory who now saw innovation as a viable path forward. Thomas Thornton, Elijah's father, sat in the front row, his 72 years weighing heavily on his frame, but his eyes bright with pride. Beside him sat the children from Silver Creek who attended the free engineering school that Elijah had founded, young minds no longer limited by poverty or prejudice. 2 years ago, Elijah began his speech, I was a blacksmith who people laughed at when I arrived to repair a broken carriage. They saw my skin color and my worn tools, and they assumed I was nothing more than cheap labor. What they didn't see was the genius that prejudice had tried to bury, the innovations that theft had tried to steal, and the determination that injustice had only strengthened. He gestured to the crowd of inventors, engineers, and craftsmen. But this celebration isn't about me. It's about all of us. Every person who was told they weren't smart enough, weren't worthy enough, weren't the right color or class or background to be an innovator. We proved them wrong not by asking for permission, but by being undeniably excellent. Catherine stood beside him, adding her own perspective. When I met Elijah on that trail, I saw something my late husband never understood, that sustainable prosperity doesn't come from exploitation, it comes from collaboration. The Thornton-Harrington partnership has generated more profit, more innovation, and more positive impact in 2 years than Caldwell Manufacturing managed in a decade of theft and fraud. She smiled at the audience. Turns out that when you actually pay people for their genius instead of stealing it, they're motivated to create even more genius. Revolutionary concept, I know. The laughter that followed was warm and genuine, but the most powerful moment came when Elijah invited forward a shy 15-year-old from Silver Creek named Isaiah, who designed an improved water filtration system for desert communities. With Catherine's backing and the Defense Center's legal protection, Isaiah's patent had been filed in his own name, something that would have been unthinkable just 3 years earlier. "This young man represents what we're really fighting for," Elijah said, his hand on Isaiah's shoulder. "Not revenge against those who wronged us, not even recognition for past achievements. We're fighting to ensure that the next generation doesn't have to climb the same mountains we did. That talent is recognized and rewarded based on merit, not skin color. That a brilliant idea from Silver Creek has the same chance as a brilliant idea from San Francisco." He looked out at the crowd, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Individual success is satisfying, but systemic change, creating a world where others don't suffer what we suffered, that's legacy. That's justice. That's what turns pain into purpose." As the sun set over Carson City, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson, Elijah reflected on the journey from that dusty trail to this moment. The scorn he'd faced hadn't disappeared. Prejudice that deep doesn't vanish in 2 years, but it had been challenged, confronted, and diminished. Catherine joined him at the window, both of them watching the workshop below where inventors of every background collaborated freely. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd just paid you for the repair and sent you back to your forge?" she asked. Elijah smiled. "Every day. But then I remember that some encounters aren't accidents. You were looking for proof that your instincts were right, that talent deserved recognition regardless of packaging. I was looking for one person with power who might actually care about justice. We found what we needed in each other." "And now?" Catherine asked. "Now we make sure that no young inventor has to wait for a chance encounter on a trail to get justice. We build the system that should have existed all along." Through the window, they could see Thomas Thornton teaching a group of children the basics of metalworking, his gnarled hands still steady and sure. They could see Maria Vasquez explaining her irrigation designs to a captivated audience. They could see young Isaiah, patent certificate in hand, already sketching his next invention. The best response to prejudice has never been individual triumph, Elijah had learned. It's tearing down the barriers so thoroughly that the next generation doesn't even know they existed. As darkness fell over Nevada territory, the lights in the Thornton Harrington workshop burned bright, a beacon of what was possible when genius met opportunity, when justice met determination, and when one widow's decision at dawn created ripples that would echo through generations. The struggling blacksmith who'd been mocked on a dusty trail was gone, transformed into something the mockers had never imagined possible, an agent of lasting change. And every patent filed, every inventor vindicated, every young mind freed from artificial limits was proof that sometimes justice delayed is simply justice gathering strength for a more powerful arrival. The dawn Catherine had promised had indeed changed Elijah's life forever, but more importantly, it had changed the lives of countless others who would never know his name, but would benefit from the doors he'd opened and the walls he'd torn down. That was the legacy worth building. That was the victory worth celebrating. That was justice finally, triumphantly, undeniably served.